So we have here, with our LIAS, our Leuven Institute of Advanced Study, we have fellows visiting, and we have discussions around artificial intelligence and reporting. Therefore, they were here, and we have chosen the team around artificial intelligence, especially for them, and also to show them how we gather at Thursdays for our lunch debate. The other issue, of course, is about football. And you know, I suppose at 4 o'clock, Belgium will play with Croatia, important match. And so the team is chosen about artificial intelligence in football play, or at least doing sport. There is awful lot of data possible to receive, but to handle the data and to get a kind of understanding of it, you need techniques, and artificial intelligence is a nice technique to at least to figure out how you can make use of the data to make ideas about what that will present in sports. And Jelle Davis of Declarative Language and Artificial Intelligence of KU Leuven will outline how that works. He will describe how it is possible to assess the impact of football players' individual actions during matches and how artificial intelligence can provide tactical insights in areas such as pressing. So it's very interesting, at least for those who are interested in football, I suppose. And then Rahul Telang, one of our LIAS fellows, will give a kind of short reply. And then we open the discussion, and then everyone can ask his or her questions. I give the floor to Jelle Davis.
Okay, so thanks. So I'm American, so I might call it soccer instead of football. But broadly speaking, in our research group, we do a lot of things on the intersection of AI and sports. So as was mentioned, sports has become an incredibly data-rich field, and you're able to collect lots of different information about players when they're doing competitions, as well as during training sessions. And so broadly speaking, I'm interested in 3 different areas. So the first thing we look at is trying to assess the performances of players during matches. So how well do they perform? Here's an example that I'm showing on the far left-hand side, where we're looking at Liverpool's recruitment strategy and how players tend to perform under high pressure and low pressure situations. And we saw an interesting pattern that Liverpool was really targeting players that performed well in high pressure situations. We're also interested in trying to gain tactical insights. So I'm actually not going to talk about that this much because it's a bit more involved on the soccer side. But one thing that we've been really interested in talking with the Federation is pressing. So here you want to try to evaluate how good is a team at a certain tactic, where do they do it, and where are they maybe less good at it. And the final thing is looking at the health statuses of players. So here you can do things in rehab, load management, and so forth. But maybe to start it off, so kind of the primary use case can be illustrated by this. So if I pose this question, right, and this is a question that everyone has an opinion about that follows soccer, if I look at, say, maybe now it's a little bit easier, but if I look at the period from 2010 to 2020, who's the better player? And why? So here, who would say that Messi is a better player? Show of hands. So show of hands for show of hands for Messi. Show of hands for Ronaldo. Right? So this is a fun question, and it's something that fans want to debate about and the media wants to debate about it. But it actually has a pretty practical implication, right? So broadly speaking, everyone's going to know who the best 25 or 50 players are, but those players are only accessible to a handful of clubs. And so if you're a scout, not at one of those, you know, Manchester United, Real Madrid, Barcelona, PSG, you have to go out and find players. Right? And the problem is there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of players in the world. I mean, there's 200 around professional leagues at least worldwide. Where are you going to get them? So scouts have to be able to track players across all these different leagues and be able to answer questions about them. So where are you going to look? And you want to know, well, how useful is the player? Are they creative? Do they fit in your style of play? How good will they be in 5 years? Will they settle in the city where my team is located, and all these things? And so they're forced to sift through these hundreds or thousands of players in order to try to think about who they should go out and get. And what I'm going to talk about then is how, for the first 2 things, data can try to help. And so because we're talking about AI, and we need to also talk about data. So it's important to know about what kind of data is available about soccer matches. So I think you can think about data as falling along a spectrum that goes from high availability and low granularity to low availability but very high granularity. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we see this match sheet data. And so this is the type of high-level counting statistics that are aggregated over the entirety of a match. And you can get like goals, shots, assists, and you can get this kind of data going back, 100 years for the American sports, for some of them even longer. And it's possible to collect this data about any match, right? So they report scores even for my kids' matches on the weekends, and you can get this. On the other end of the spectrum, what you can do is you can go and put cameras in the actual stadiums. So all the top level leagues will have these. They'll have somewhere between 8 and 14 different cameras installed at fixed locations. And what this allows you to do is track the location of the players and ball multiple times per second. Okay, the flip side is that this is extremely expensive. I mean, you're paying tens of thousands, if not maybe up to 100,000 euros a year to get this data. And this data isn't shared. So if you go to the Spanish league, you would have access to your own data, but it's not shared across teams within the league. Right, so the Belgian league, it is shared, so you might not have lots of this. And you're certainly not getting it if you're a Belgian league team, you're not going to get it about an English league team. So in the middle is event stream data. And so what this event stream data is people watch the matches and they annotate events that happen. So this is things like passes, shots, tackles, cards, things like this over the course of the match, often also with the location, the players involved, the timestamps. So maybe to illustrate this, we could start by looking at some video. So here's maybe a happy memory from 4 years ago for Belgian fans, right? The end of the, better than the recent ones. Right, so you watch what happens. Courtois collects, plays it to Benabrana, crosses, Lukaku dummies, and they score to beat Japan at the buzzer. Okay, so this is full video. You would get something like this out of the optical tracking. So what would this look like in this event data? So you can think about the event data as this. Right, so the first thing you would see is that the Benabrana gets the ball and carries it upfield. You'd see where he starts, where he ends. Then you would see a pass, that it's successful, where the pass started, where it ended, who was the target. You would see this cross, where it started, where it ended, who it was to, and you would see the shot action, where it was taken, was it successful, maybe where it ended up in the goal. And so this is the type of information you have. It gives you a lot more detail than match sheet, but you're still missing things because you don't know the locations of the other players and things like this. But there's lots of it. You can get this for really hundreds of leagues worldwide. You can get tens of millions or hundreds of millions of these events going back 10 or 15 years. Okay, so what did we then do? So the first thing we looked at is trying to value on-the-ball actions. All right, so let's look at some videos again. So here's a play from Chelsea against Man City. You see this long pass from Fabregas to Hazard. He has great control. Tries to cut it back, but can't do it. So if you were to look at things like accounting statistics on this, what do you get? Well, there's no shot, there's no goal, there's no assist. So okay, I guess you get a completed pass. So it helps your pass completion percentage, but that's all that would be recorded on traditional things. Here's another sequence from a Barcelona match. So what happens? Busquets plays the ball to Messi. He dribbles past a bunch of people, he shoots and he scores. All right, so if you look at the data, how was this scored? Well, Messi gets the goal, Busquets gets an assist. But clearly that pass is less useful than the one that from the first clip. And as a final illustration, we will look at Manchester City, the sequence, right? So we'll see Aymeric Laporte is going to play this ball down. It's going to cross for a goal. So what is this? All right, so Jesus gets the goal. Sané gets the assist, and Laporte gets this completed pass, but it's really his pass that sprung the action, right? So this was really the key action in the sequence. But again, in these important counting statistics, assists and goals, there's nothing coming up. So what this tells us is that we have these traditional statistics, but they're very limited, right? So it's a limited number of actions, shots, assists. So we need to really consider many more actions. And the other thing is we really have to consider the context of an action. So a lateral pass in the midfield is not as useful as, a diagonal through ball that switches the play, a take-on in the midfield versus a take-on in the penalty box. These things are quite different. And so we really want to be able to capture some sort of the context, right? Okay, so this is what our goal is. So we think about this, we just kind of have this tracking of the ball, and that's it. We see who has the ball and what they do with it. And based on data like this, what we want to do is we want to try to assign a numeric value to each of these on-the-ball actions that a player might perform in terms of how useful it is to their team. Okay, so this is actually pretty complicated because if I think about this, when they're recording these things, there's between, depending on what gets recorded, there could be somewhere between 1,600 and 3,000 of these events in a match. But an average soccer match has like 2.7 goals in it. I think 1-0 is still among the most common score lines. So I have to be able to pick out, right, from this one goal, if I pick out kind of any random action, like some pass that might not be anywhere close to this, I have to be able to say, well, how useful is this? What did this do in terms of improving my team's chances of winning? Okay, so how are we going to go about doing this? So if we think about this, what happens when you perform an action like a pass? So we have a pass, or we have some sort of game situation. And I execute the pass, and that pass is changing the game situation. And typically, if we think about this conceptually, why does a player want to perform a certain action? At a high level, they want to probably do one of two things. So the first thing they might want to do is try to increase their team's probability of scoring. So you want to increase your team's chances of scoring. On the other hand, you might do something to try to decrease your team's chances of conceding a goal. And so they have these two kind of high-level ideas. And what we can then do is we can try to take these ideas, right, the chance, a probability of scoring, and a probability of conceding, and use them to assign a value to each of these game situations. And the value of that game situation then is the probability of scoring, say in the next 5 to 10 seconds or 5 to 10 actions, minus the probability of conceding in the next, same thing, 5 to 10 seconds or 5 to 10 actions. And if I can do this, right, so this is a problem I know how to solve because it's a probability estimation problem and I have lots of data, then I can assign these values to these game situations. And then I can come up with a value for each action, which is simply the difference between the values of consecutive game situations, right? So the second game situation is valued at 0.5 and the first one at 0.01, well, then that pass was 0.04. So intuitively, you can think about this as that each action then is valued as a player's contribution to the expected score differential in a match. So if I look at, the goals your team scores minus the expected number of goals that your team should score minus the expected number of goals that the opposing team should score, we're going to value actions, how you contribute to this. And I'm not going to go into the details about all the machine learning, but roughly speaking, on an intuitive level, how do we find these probabilities? So we can go back and we can look at, millions of actions. So when we've trained these models, we've done it on up to like 10 million actions. So what you can think about is, if I give you a particular game situation, I can search through that huge database of these 10 million actions that I have and find the 100 or 1,000 most similar ones. And then I can just simply say, okay, well, how many of them led to a goal for your team in the next 10 actions? How many of them led to a goal for the other team in the next 10 actions? And I get these probabilities to assign the things. So it's a little bit more complicated than this obviously, but intuitively, this is what you can kind of think about this as doing. Great. So let's illustrate this in action. So here's another clip from a while ago, Barcelona against Real Madrid, Barcelona's final goal in the match. Is this going to play? All right, so what happens? So we start off with a pass. Didn't really affect the probability of scoring, 0. A backwards pass, maybe this slightly altered it. A through ball, so this takes it from a more defensive position to a pretty good position, positively valued. So Messi does a take on into the box, so he takes the ball from outside of the box into the box. That's pretty useful. He cuts it back from the sideline to the front of the goal. Useful again, and then Alexis Vidal shoots and scores, and you get some credit for converting the goal. So intuitively, what we can see is that these actions that help a team get into a better position for scoring are positively valued, and the other actions that are not doing that get a value close to 0. Okay, so if we can go back, I can show you, if you think back to those first 2 clips I showed you, so of the pass from Fabregas to Hazard versus this lateral pass from Busquets to Messi, what we see is that the first pass is valued about 7 times, is considered about 7 times more valuable than that lateral pass. So we're really picking up on some context there. So what is this useful for? So I said scouting, right? So here is an illustration that we actually did. So this was done at the time. It was in the original paper that we submitted on this back in 2018. And we looked just as an interesting exercise at who were the best under 21 players in the Dutch league after that season. And this is because we were doing this in collaboration with a data intelligence company, Sci Sports, that's based out of the Netherlands. So they were interested in this. They provide information to soccer clubs. So we looked, right, and here's who came out on the list. So we see David Neres, Mason Mount, Frenkie de Jong, Steven Bergwijn, Donny van de Beek. And their ratings and their market values at the time. So a year later, when the paper was accepted, we went back, and here's what their market values were. So this was the year before Ajax went on the run to the Champions League semifinals and almost made it to the final. And so if you look at this list, I mean, this is not bad, right? I mean, so Mason Mount is a key player for England and Chelsea. Frenkie de Jong and Steven Bergwijn are in the Dutch team. Van de Beek had to move to Man United, but maybe the manager wasn't so interested in him, so his career is maybe stalled. And so maybe the first one is the biggest miss, but this is not bad in retrospect. Scouting is hard. So there's some interesting insights. And then we can use this also to revisit that first question. So we went back and we looked from 2012, which is about the earliest that we had data from, to 2020, right before Messi went to PSG. How are some of the biggest names performing? So let's look at 2012 to 2020 seasons for a bunch of players. So here's Eden Hazard's progression. Pretty good, actually. You know, he's would clearly be in the top 10, top 20 in this metric over the last decade. Pretty consistent performance. Even his first year in Real Madrid, I mean, it dips a bit, but not as much as you might expect. Then you can look at people like Mo Salah. Right? So he was a pretty unexpected find when he transferred from Roma to Liverpool. He's done pretty well. He's slightly better than Hazard. We can look at Robert Lewandowski, who was great for Dortmund and then Munich, around the same as Salah. Kylian Mbappe, you can see a clear upward trajectory. Neymar, also pretty good, pretty consistent. Ronaldo's a little bit better, but we can see that after 2004, he started to decline. And then there's like Messi, who is, you know, clearly much better than the other players. Right? So this is actually one of the things that people use to evaluate these models. If you look at anything offensive and Messi's not in the top 5, then it's not good. So we can show you, I have a backup slide if you want to see, but basically the big difference between them is Ronaldo only generates value by shooting, right? And Messi generates value by shooting and doing other things, which helps. Okay, and I'll talk about one other thing that we've done more recently, which is measuring passing creativity. And so here I'm showing you a list of the most creative players, in the English League last year. So we actually only had data for the top 10 teams. So lucky for us, Kevin De Bruyne was the top ranked player. So who else would you expect to see on such a list in England? Any other guesses of names that might be on there? Yeah, good guess. Other people? Who? No. Yeah, okay, well, like, you know, maybe people like Trent Alexander-Arnold or things like this. Okay, So what is creativity? I mean, this is like something that if you read or listen to the media, they'll talk about it. If you ask coaches, they'll also talk about it, or scouts. But what is it? How can we kind of define it? All right. So here's just to show you. So there's articles you can go and see. People look at this. Scouts and clubs are looking for a creative player. They want them on the team. So one definition that we've taken that comes from the economics literature is the ability to produce work that is both novel. So here we'll define novel as unexpected and appropriate. But I think in the context of soccer, appropriate, a better definition of appropriate is useful. Okay, so we can then use this, and how could we translate this into something for creativity in terms of passing? So we can say that a player performs a creative pass if it differs from what a typical player would have decided to do in a situation, and it results in a more promising potential outcome than that typical action. So let's make this more concrete again with the help of videos. So first, if we look at the, I go back. All right, so the first pass is a pass from Kevin De Bruyne. And if you watch, the thing you expect to do is he's going to pass to the guy going down the middle. But what does he do instead? Is he arcs the ball around the player that's running all alone. So this is, most players, you watch this and you say, well, how did he possibly see that? And how did he possibly execute it? So most players would not do this, right? But this is extremely useful because he, instead of playing it into the obvious option, who's covered, he arcs it into the guy running free. So pretty original, pretty useful. Here's another example where he's going to play a pass. But this is, again, this is the kind of the obvious pass. Most players would see this. There's a player, running free on the right side. That's an easy pass to see. The other ones are hard. So it's useful, but it's what, a typical player would probably do. And as a final example, here's a long pass he's going to play. Again, he kind of tries to arc it into space. But Alexander-Arnold, he kind of misses and it gets knocked out of bounds. So this is definitely creative, but we don't know if it's useful because it ended up going out of bounds, right? So I'm not going to talk a lot about how we did this, but you have to be able to kind of separate a player's ability to conceive a pass, to see a passing option that most people wouldn't see, and actually execute that pass. Okay, so we came up with a creative decision rating. And what we did then is we looked at the following, right? So we have a value of a player's passing decision. So again, we can think about valuing the player's passing decision using an analogous metric that I presented in the first part of the talk. So roughly speaking, how much does it increase their team's odds of scoring? Right? And so a typical pass, if they have the player with the ball here, with the white dot, so it's again a pass from Kevin De Bruyne, he's behind the defensive player in this case. Typical pass might be to play it to that player there short. So this we get a decision rating, creativity rating of 0 because you pick the typical thing with the value. A less typical option would be to lay it off into space on the sidelines. So this would be not typical, but probably not as useful because it's less useful to have the ball on the flank than to have the ball centrally. And what he actually did was play this long diagonal to cut through. So this is an original pass, and again, it's highly valuable because it gets the ball pretty close to the goal. So intuitively, we can kind of see things like this. And another thing to note for this data, which we got from StatsBomb, is we actually had a little bit more information. So for each action, they included a freeze frame so you could get the locations of some of the other players that were near the ball. So you could really see where these passing lanes did and did not exist. Okay, so if we go back then, so if we look at what this list looks like, we see some familiar names. So perhaps the second name was a little bit unexpected. Trent Alexander-Arnold is known as being a very creative player, so is Ziyech. So there were some names that one would expect coming out. And if you look at this, I mentioned that there's two kind of issues. You have to be able to conceive the pass, and you have to be able to execute it. And this is hard to be good at both. And you can see that there are certainly players that are creative, but not as good at executing it. So Rafinha and Kane are creative, but their execution is less good. De Bruyne and Mason Mount, are pretty creative and also pretty good at executing. So there are only very few of these players that are able to kind of combine both of these abilities. All right, so to wrap up, so there's loads of different data that you can get about soccer matches, and this data can really be used to get lots of interesting insights into a player's performance. This can be very useful for data-driven scouting. You can also do other interesting things related to tactics and so forth. Right? And we have approaches for looking at how to value these actions that are really able to consider the context of the action and look at different attributes of it, such as the creativity. So there's lots of use cases beyond scouting. I haven't had time to talk about this, but I think it is also important to emphasize that this aspect, the AI aspect and the data aspect, is just really one small piece of a much larger puzzle. And you really have to consider all these other things. There's a lot of domain knowledge and thought that goes into doing this, and a much larger picture that a team has to consider. Obviously, I haven't done all this work by myself, so a lot of this work has been done in collaboration with current or former PhD students and our collaborators. StatsBomb provided some of the data. And if you're interested in this, the code is publicly available, not for the creativity stuff, but for the action value stuff, it's there. There's a blog that we run that has different demonstrations of this and some interactive visualizations for different things, including World Cup predictions and so forth. So now I guess I hand the floor over to Rahul.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Rahul Telang, and I'm so happy. A great presentation, Jesse. I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to take a slightly different viewpoint. By no means I'm an expert in soccer. Some of you are, but I'm not. So I will use that just as a placeholder. But let me come back to what I think about this whole idea. Number one, I think Jesse already made very clear that the sports are really a best domain to apply the data science. And the reason for that is the data that we get from the sports is amazing and huge. And if you look at the machine learning or the AI, they require data to be able to train the algorithm. So this is one domain where the growth in the machine learning and the AI is really going leaps and bounds. One thing I think you didn't mention, one of the direction where the sports is going is to help the umpires or the referees. And the referees and umpires have a really hard task. They have to make a split-second decision. And sometimes whatever they do, we don't agree with that. We always complain that our team lost because the referee was not really good. So a lot of efforts are going on to help the umpires to be able to make the more error-free decision, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I think Jesse also mentioned that the teams are also trying to recruit some new players, which are new, unknown, nobody knows how will they do. So they have to make a bet that when I select this player, is he or is she going to be worthwhile or not? And sometimes that's a really difficult decision. I don't have to convince you that the scouts in this team, they get paid millions of dollars because that's what they do. That's what they get paid for. And that's where the data, machine learning, and AI is playing a big role. And one thing that I already talked about that, but one thing I think you didn't mention, maybe you did mention, the way I look at the AI or the big data or the machine learning, is it able to provide us some information that we cannot get by our common sense? That is it able to, are we able to uncover some patterns, some strategies, some action that are not so obvious to us? And going back to, I think what Jesse said, is Ronaldo better than Messi? That's a really hard question. We already know so many things. We already have a preconceived notion. A much more interesting question, I think you meant that. Imagine a 1,000 ranked player and a 2,000 ranked player. And now you have to select between this or that. They both are unknown. Nobody knows how valuable they are. We haven't heard their name. But the team has to sign somebody. Who do they sign? On what basis they sign? And that's exactly where the data in the machine learning can be extremely useful, because they can uncover the patterns that are not so visible to us, and they're extremely valuable to the firm. So, just let me just come back. I don't know how many people here know baseball. The very famous term that is used in baseball is called Moneyball. In the Moneyball, this was the strategy used by the Oakland A's, which is one of the small market teams, and they had to compete with the Boston Red Sox and Yankees, and they had no resources. However, what Oakland A's did at that time, they used the data to make decisions to be able to hire people who do well, and they actually did really well. In fact, they spread the use of data analysis in the team so much that people were impressed that Oakland A's, it's a small team, they're recruiting players which are kind of unknown. Everybody had written them off. They're saying that, why are they signing him? And they signed him up, and the player actually did well. And everybody was saying, what is Oakland A's doing that we can't figure out? And the Oakland A's were basically saying, I'm going to use the data and make unemotional decision. I will not make decision based on my emotion. I'll make the decision based on what I see. And what they did was, they were able to uncover something that people could not think of. And they made it so popular. They made it so popular that the data team in every sport team, whether it's baseball or football, it's a standard. Like every team in the American sport, they have a team of data scientists. They have like 5-10 people, because this approach showed them that it can actually give them a competitive edge. And that basically ballooned the growth of data. And obviously, now we're trying to push the envelope and say that, can we use the AI, can we use the machine learning to be able to uncover something that we cannot figure out from the naked eye. One other thing that the good football, when I use baseball is a much better match. The reason for that is, a lot of time baseball, a duel is between the pitcher and the hitter. Unlike soccer, which tend to be a team sport, it's really hard to figure out the value of one player or one play. This is much easier. The pitcher is pitching, the hitter is hitting, and there's a fielder there. And then you can figure out, is my pitcher valuable? Is he able to generate the value for me? Because now they can see that, are you able to strike him out? Are you able to not hit him? Are you able to do X, Y, Z? So there are a lot of strategies that go on in selecting a hitter and selecting a pitcher and where to put the fielders. And what the AI and the machine learning data is doing is giving the tools to the manager that if this type of hitter comes in, send this type of pitcher. If this type of pitcher comes in, send this type of hitter. And sometimes those things are not so obvious. Sometimes they're obvious. This pitcher comes in, send this hitter. But sometimes they're not so clear. Because you have the data, then you realize that this pitcher can do something, but hitter can do something that actually gives them an edge, and I want to send him. And that's why in the baseball, it's more visible. What is the value of the pitcher, value of the hitter, value of the fielder? That kind of makes it a little easier to figure out that the use of all those techniques, are they generating the value that we see in the sport. I think all of these things are much easier in the baseball compared to what we see in the soccer. I already said that, so I won't repeat it, and given that we have a short time. At the end of the day, from a team point of view, they have to think about, should I spend my money and time in getting all this data and do this analysis? They intuitively have to make a decision that, is it worth me to hire 5 people, hire a consulting firm, and spend the money to get the data and do the analysis? What do I get in return? So they are all implicitly making a decision, right or wrong. But the bottom line is that that's what we are seeing, that the teams are showing that, especially with the lower ranked player. It's very, very clear that the data plays a huge role, not just in baseball, in football. you're selecting people, a football player down 150th rank. And now you're saying, should I select him or him? They are both sort of unknown. And who you select actually can make an impact on how your team is going to do on the field. And that's where, and this is one of my, I wouldn't use the word theory, but this is one of my argument, or one of the, why do we have scouts? They have because they go, talk, collect the data, and figure out the judgment. And now we have the machine learning AI algorithm. You can imagine, now that I have the AI and the machine learning algorithm, number one, either they can replace my scout. I don't need scout now. I don't need a 10 people scout team. Only 5 will do because I got these people to replace. Or they can complement my scouts. That is a combination of my AI and the scout can generate a lot more value than scout alone or the AI alone. And I feel like, I don't think that's an easy question to answer, but those are kind of the questions that we want to be able to answer, that how is this helping, in what way, in what regard. I already mentioned that the soccer is actually team sport, which kind of makes it hard. I think how do you evaluate? But you can figure out some way to say that, is it worthwhile for me to invest my money and time into generating this AI machine learning insights that can help me in some direction. And one of the direction I think can be, which are more obscure players. In that case, you can hopefully make a more confident decision that I will take him or him. And then actually see in the real world that selecting him actually generated more value compared to somebody who was above rank him, whatever, what the common sense, what the world was saying, they select him, but my data is saying select him. I bet on my data, selected him, and look at my payoff. And that's where I think potentially there could be some empirical evidence that what we are doing with the data, with X, Y, Z can be useful. And in baseball, if you've seen the baseball, the umpire has to make a decision, is it a ball or a strike? And that happens to be a really controversial. That's when the fans fight, oh no, it was a strike, you called a ball, the guy hit a home run, my team could have won. And what is happening in the Major League Baseball, the direction is going that the umpire will not call balls and strike, and the AI will do that. That is, a technology is going to be there. Who is going to call a ball or strike? It will be taken away from the umpire. And the goal is that the whole thing can become more transparent. You can take all the human element out of the sport. In fact, some people complain that don't take the human element, they want it. But the bottom line is that that's what we want, and that's what the direction is going. Same thing to extend in the soccer that, do you select a player or not in a team? Sometimes that tends to be more emotional decision. All, what Jesse is saying and what we're learning, that maybe a team can be very transparent. The coach can actually go and tell the player that based on what I'm seeing, this is what you do, this is what the other guy do. In this context, he is better than you. And that's why I want him in my team compared to you. And hopefully, that can make it more transparent, more easier for the player to know that he is benched compared to his, the other player, because the data shows very clearly that he will generate value, not in terms of goal, but all the things that just kind of make, So I talk too much, so I'm going to stop here.
So now it's time for asking questions. Yeah. First of all.
Good afternoon. I'm an engineer, so I like data. This is great. I don't think we can go back in the presentation, but you had a page which showed the value added, the monetary value of the player, and then the year afterwards. And you saw that the second best player was undervalued compared to his value added, and he was equally undervalued the year after.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So how much does this?
So how do you get?
Now the question I have is, how much does this approach explain of the value assigned to a player?
probably, yeah, so transfer values, so coming up with the transfer values we're using there are transfermarket.com, which is kind of crowdsourced, and it's a guess. And it's really hard to think about what a transfer value would be because there's a lot of different factors that would play into it. So the age of the player, their current contract status, the league they're in, their image. You're not buying certain people, so it's. Yeah, so maybe I think he was undervalued. So he was on the books at Chelsea, and he had been loaned out to like lots of different clubs, right? So every year a different club, and so I think this was probably some sort of contextual.
Once they started to apply, what I saw in Moneyball is once they started to apply more rigorously a data-driven approach, that the transfer value tended to go up in line with the analysis. So yeah. I'm just wondering when this approach will reach that level.
Well, it sort of has. I mean, now, so Liverpool is probably the most data-driven of the clubs, and the amount, I think, now if people presume that if Liverpool is interested in a player, that they're probably onto something, and their prices go up. So I think it's a little bit team. I mean, so it's also a little bit team-specific. So it's football's a bit more soccer's a bit more complicated in that, you know.
Okay, next question.
So I have two short questions.
Yeah.
One, you show that companies or esports leagues are interested in AI and its application to the sports, and they're willing to pay for it. So why should universities spend taxpayers' money doing the same, or maybe even less well? Second question, you said that you know, there was a shortage of high granularity data, but as far as I can remember, for decades, you know, tons of soccer games have been broadcast on television, so I assume, unless they've thrown all those tapes away, that these data are by and large still available, maybe not accessible. So why is there still a shortage of data?
Okay. So the second question is probably easier to answer. So, so there is work on tracking data from broadcast footage. Clubs are somewhat skeptical about its use because not all players are in frame, and it's harder, right? Because it's not fixed location. You have to figure out, are they showing the crowd? Are they showing the match? There's all these things. That's the issues, but you can get, people are doing that. It is harder to go back a really long time than you think, because when it was really film, they would literally cut the film right in to make the highlights, and then, you know, there don't exist complete games in a single reel anymore. The second question is, well, like, one, I think the universities use lots of things that have economical benefit. Right? There's a whole tech transfer office here, and they're eager for things to do tech transfer. We have a spin-off on the health aspects of sports. And I think the other reason is, I mean, it's something that I guess part of the university's mission is also to engage with the broader public, right? And so this is something that is really easy to communicate and has generated a lot of interest. We've been contacted by people like high school students and stuff that have been interested, and we're able to engage on them in a level that I don't think you're able to do with the kind of the really pure advanced research. So I think.
I mean, sometimes these kind of things open the job market. You know, the sports become like a big deal, and they end up hiring the students from the university. It can also become a way for the university to launch a course, maybe launch a program, which actually can have a demand in the market. So by doing all this, first of all, obviously, they want a spin-off. You know, somebody opens a firm, become $1 billion worth, they are willing to give some money back to the university. University owns some part of that, but that's being, you know, extreme. The more common thing is that when it becomes percolate down the line, their job, and your students are able to get the job, and that actually, you know, economically beneficial beyond being societal.
Two short questions. First, how does sports news reporting affect the statistical aspect of sports analysis? For example, give the example of how the highlight reels, so the physical archives have been cut by older generations of sports journalists. But are there other ways in which the data is influenced by news reporting? for example, indirectly, whether if a player gets a certain amount of celebrity, does that actually put more resources into them, which then gives them a bit of an advantage over another player, for instance? Second question is on the comparison of baseball to football and the role of variables. How absolute is the ascription of creativity? For example, you showed one scene in which the player kicked the ball backward, and you marked that -1. Right, but how do you assess whether that was not actually still productive towards the actual goal? Thank you.
Yeah, right. So the second one, that backwards pass, so that's like a big, how useful a backwards pass is a pretty big open question in the midfield. There are definitely times, so I think there's like a couple of things to say. So it's really hard to assign value in the midfield, right? So anything kind of close to the goal, you get pretty good differentiation. Things in the midfield, it's all kind of more or less the same. You can see things that are positively valued if you can kind of open up space in some way, if you can kind of switch the direction to a place where a player has a lot of space to run into. But I'd say that's like a pretty big open question about how useful backwards passes are. The first one is a good question, and I don't know if I have a good answer to it about how it affects things. I mean, I guess the more famous you are, the more you can invest. I mean, athletes are spending a lot of money, oftentimes with their own money, to have a team of specialists support them throughout the year, whether it's a personal trainer or whatever kind of recovery they think they need. I mean, I think some American football players are spending 6-7 figures of salary a year to kind of like maintain their bodies. And I think the more famous you are and the more endorsements you have, the easier that is to do. And that could affect their longevity and therefore their performance and earning. But I think that's a hard question.
Okay, thank you. So your conversation today is in fact part of a larger discussion we have this week with Metaforum and the Leuven Institute of Advanced Study around AI and media. So we have been touching about two aspects that I also would like your ideas. The first one is on diversity. So of course you have been talking in the beginning about the different values that teams can have, like the kind of players they're looking for, the tactics they have, the kind of play they want to show to their supporters. So do you think this is something that can be taken into account in the AI algorithms, that they can like configure what they are looking for? And the second part is like people reacting on AI systems, because of course if the value in the market will be determined by an algorithm, then maybe people will learn about how this works and they will start behaving such that their market value will increase, what we call gaming the system. So what do you think about these two aspects?
So the second one again, so like players definitely use this, right? So Kevin De Bruyne fired his agent and he used data analysts to help negotiate his most recent contract. And I know in American football, there's a company called Pro Football Focus, and they like grade every player for every play and match and things like this. And the players will use this to try to negotiate their salaries. But is it Goodhart's law, right? When the target becomes, whenever you try to optimize for something of success, players will do this, and it can skew the system. So that can definitely happen. I think it's probably harder to do in soccer because there's so much going on within the context of the team than some other sports. Teams can definitely configure it. I mean, I don't think, certainly not in soccer, there's no one's making a decision based on like a number like this, right? This is, how would they use this? I mean, you have to want to come up with a short list of players. I mean, if you think about this, you need to go get a player in a certain position. You're probably going to be considering 5 to 10 to 25 players. And like, how do you come up with that list, right? So you probably are going to use the data to come up with a list of 100 that you're then going to sort down to who you're going to prioritize. And it's not going to be used as like a deciding or a determining factor. It might tell you where to look. It might tell you, if you do live scouting, did you see them play their worst game or their best game, or, you know, like give some indication about the level of performance of the opposing team, right? So it can provide this sort of contextual information. But
you would not recommend it to have some handles inside Elven for the teams or for the management of the teams? So you're saying you have to supplement it with additional information?
So they would. I mean, I think where they would probably have some handles for like inside the team is if you want to look at kind of a match in a style of play. Like, do they do things that would fit well within your team? And like, can you kind of characterize how they play and how your team plays, and is it a match? And I guess on a league level, like there's a question about each league has a different style. Like the Dutch league is more open. The German league, there's a lot of pressing. The English league is like very high intensity. Belgian league is maybe more physical, and like, are there certain league pairs where it's easier to translate between from others, and that could probably be looked at in a data-driven way.
Thank you. I feel like as long as the data and its use becomes standardized, so you know that if you are higher here, then everybody knows that you're higher. There's no ambiguity. If that is the case, actually data makes it even field. Then your agent and the team can negotiate saying that, okay, look at this number, that's higher for me, I need more money. The trouble what you're saying happens is that you agree, you decide on some number, the team might throw a number to you and say, you know what, my number shows that you're worth less. Your agent might throw a number and say, no, I'm worth more. And that's really where the potential controversy comes in. I don't know whether we will have an ideal world where we can have a number which can decide, but in many cases there is. I mean, many cases, I can go back to again the US, when they have a draft season that they have to select the player, who they want to draft. Usually they have a number 1 draft, number 2 draft, number 30 draft. And broadly, people have an agreement that these are the 5 players who should go in number 1. And typically, almost always, one of those 5 goes in number 1. So sometimes there's agreement, sometimes there is not. And I feel like when there's agreement, there's actually less chance of a dispute. Sorry, I gave a long answer.
Been really fascinating. I kind of have 2 questions here. The first one, which you've kind of covered a bit, but I want to ask a bit more directly, is there looking into what makes a flop? Like in terms of like what makes a player that's predicted to be, statistically awesome and then failing, like if there are any kind of common things, but of course it's such a complicated question, but I don't know, I figured it's worth asking. And the second question is perhaps not as interesting to everyone else here, but I'm a big American football fan. So I'm curious about like if teams in the NFL, because I mean, of course there's PFF, but are you seeing this like them trying to use this for the draft? Because we see crazy, like how much of a gamble it is. You got like Johnny Manziel burning out, and then you got Tom Brady in the 7th round becoming considered to be the greatest of all time.
I think that's hard to say. I think you would really have to have insights. I mean, I think there are lots of things at play. I mean, you don't know if someone's wife's going to like living in a certain city and how that might affect them, or you don't know about like the mental aspect, right? Like, do they have like the drive to continue and push? You give people a lot of money. Does that change them? I mean, I think there's lots of things that could potentially happen, and it's hard to say. I think something that's probably very hard to quantify is also like things on decision making. So I think a lot of things, like if you take soccer, I mean, I think there are lots of people that can actually like execute the actions. What is hard, and it's hard to train, is like doing it at intensity. So like, can you do it quickly?
I just add one more thing. Everybody knows that the world is very uncertain. The teams know it, players know it, everybody knows it. So the whole point of having this data is that, am I able to reduce my error? Let's just say I used to select player without the AI and data. I used to have a 50% hit rate. I select a player, 50% time he'll fail. Then I start using the data AI. Now my hit rate has improved to 55. And that is what they want. That is what they want to see. Then you said how the team in the NFL use it. All I'll say is that one of my colleagues, he was a faculty, an econ faculty in my school. He left the job to join Philadelphia Eagle for precisely this question. I don't know how well he's done, I don't even know, but that tells you that the teams actually value that.
Who is following it by streaming. So he asks, in these models, the focus seems to be on the ball actions, but how are off the ball actions taken into account? Because these actions are also as important or even more important in my eyes.
They are important, but we don't have, you would need the optical tracking data to do it, and we don't have it. So yeah, you would have to have the optical tracking, and then you can start to think about it, and there are approaches based on that. There's one that came out from FC Barcelona that also looked at maybe a bit more.
Beginning of their development, I suppose. So we can expect in the future very complex and very detailed, better applications.
Yes, but it's hard to get that kind of data.
Okay. Johanna?
Are these models as good at detecting, the ranking mediocre players as they are at discriminating top players? So are these behaviors that you would expect, the majority of people that are playing for professional British football or whatever to discriminate between them?
I think it's really hard to evaluate how good the models are. I mean, I think that there is definitely, I think, yeah, you can definitely use it to find hidden gems. I mean, it's definitely possible. There are definitely good examples. There are definitely good examples of this.
But it's not that great for actually the...
Well, I mean, I think I think it is pretty good for scouting. I think a lot of people, if you take someone like Andy Robertson, so apparently this was a data-driven insight. I mean, he was on a team that was relegated. No one was interested in him. They didn't spend a lot of money, and he's been great. So I definitely think that it is good. I mean, other teams not in England are also using this stuff. So I think it is definitely useful for kind of a full range of players.
Last question. Yeah. So different managers have different playing styles, and it's quite easy to see that when watching football. But in general, or is there something really specific where that jumps out in the data? For instance, in your presentation, what was notable was that Liverpool's wing backs are their most creative players, whereas with Man City it goes through Kevin De Bruyne instead.
Mm-hmm. You can see this in the data, and we've looked at playing style. I have an example of this. If you take Kyle Walker and Trent Alexander, and you look at different zones, Kyle Walker never does a long diagonal pass, and Alexander-Arnold does it all the time, and you can see this coming through in the data about where they're doing, and you can see where Liverpool draws people off sides with their high line and all this, so this stuff does come through in the data as well. There's examples in the blog if you wanna look at it.
Okay. I will close this session. You can ask your questions still in an informal way after we want to end at time, because otherwise people don't come back, because it always go over time. Thank you very much for this very interesting introduction, for the reply.